For years, Spirit seemed to have a habit of outlasting expectations. It crossed the Martian surface long after its planned mission had ended. It kept sending images, kept gathering science, kept moving across a world of dust, rock, and ancient volcanic plains. Route maps stretched farther and farther across the landscape. Each new track another reminder that this rover had already survived longer than almost anyone expected. From a distance, Spirit looked less like a machine completing a mission and more like an explorer that simply refused to stop, which makes the ending feel almost impossible. How does a rover that survived year after year become trapped by a patch of sand? The answer begins with a wheel. Near a region called Home Plate, Spirit entered an area that looked ordinary enough. The ground appeared firm. The terrain offered no obvious warning. Then one of the rover's wheels began to sink. Bright Martian soil surfaced around the buried wheel. The rover's tracks deepened. Commands from Earth produced movement, but not the movement anyone wanted. Wheels turned, dust shifted. The rover settled deeper. At first, this looked like a mobility problem. Spirit had escaped difficult terrain before. Mars was full of obstacles. Recovery was part of exploration. The expectation was simple: identify the problem, plan an extraction, drive away. The tracks surrounding the rover seemed to support that belief. They showed effort, attempts, motion. What they did not show was escape. Weeks became months. Engineers tested maneuvers on Earth. They recreated the terrain. They adjusted driving strategies. Commands crossed millions of miles to Mars. Wheels spun again. The buried wheel remained buried. The tracks around Spirit grew into a strange pattern. Lines leading outward. Lines curving back. Marks of movement that ultimately went nowhere. A possibility disappeared. The rover might not drive free. Yet something about the situation remained contradictory. Spirit was still alive. Its instruments still functioned. Its systems still responded. Communication continued. If the rover itself remained healthy, perhaps being stuck was not fatal. Maybe exploration would continue from a stationary position. Maybe mobility was the loss, but not survival. That explanation held for a while. Then winter began moving closer. On Mars, survival depends heavily on sunlight. Solar panels collect energy. Batteries store it. Heaters protect vital components from temperatures that plunge far below anything experienced on Earth. For a rover that can move, winter is something to prepare for. For a rover that cannot move, winter becomes something else entirely. A trap. The problem was no longer the buried wheel. The problem was geometry. Spirit sat in a position that could not easily be changed. As the seasons shifted, the sun would climb lower in the sky. Every day, sunlight would strike the rover at a less favorable angle. Every day, the margin for survival would shrink. The image that now mattered most was not the wheel buried in soil. It was the winter sun near the Martian horizon. The rover needed energy. Energy depended on sunlight. Sunlight depended on position. And position was the one thing Spirit could no longer control. Another option disappeared. Escape was no longer the goal. Survival was. As winter approached, engineers searched for ways to improve Spirit's posture. Small adjustments, tiny gains, any increase in tilt toward the sun could help. The effort resembled a stranded traveler trying to turn toward a distant fire before the cold arrives. But the season moved faster than the rover. The sun continued its slow descent. Power production began to decline. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. just enough to matter. The change appeared in energy readings, in operating margins, in calculations that became less comfortable with each passing week. A rover that once had flexibility now had fewer choices. Certain activities became harder to justify. Some operations consumed too much energy. Some opportunities could no longer be risked. The story advanced through subtraction, not through failure. Through loss of options, the buried wheel had removed mobility. Winter began removing alternatives. Soon the rover entered survival-focused operations. Conserving energy became increasingly important. Systems could not assume tomorrow would provide enough power to replace what was spent today. The mission had transformed. Spirit was no longer primarily exploring Mars. Spirit was enduring Mars. The contradiction remained visible the entire time. The rover was still functioning. The situation was still worsening. Those two realities existed together. A healthy machine trapped in an increasingly unhealthy position. Eventually, communication itself became part of the survival equation. As power margins narrowed, uncertainty grew. Signals still arrived, but the future of those signals became harder to predict. Would Spirit remain warm enough? Would batteries survive? Would critical systems endure the cold months ahead? The questions no longer concerned driving. They concerned waking up. Then came silence. Not necessarily permanent silence, just silence. The kind that leaves room for hope. The kind that allows one more possibility to remain. Spirit entered low-power states. Contact attempts continued. Antennas on Earth listened. Across vast distances, giant dishes of the deep space network pointed toward Mars. Waiting became part of the mission. Winter passed. Spring approached. The reasoning seemed straightforward. If Spirit could survive long enough, increasing sunlight might recharge the rover. A signal might return. A simple transmission could erase months of uncertainty. So the listening continued. Days passed. Then weeks. Then months. The antennas kept listening. Nothing answered. Another option disappeared. Then another. Then another. The possibility of recovery slowly narrowed in the same way Spirit's energy margin once had. Not through a dramatic moment. Through absence. The final chapter unfolded as a series of unanswered calls. Engineers continued searching for signs of life. Commands were transmitted. Listening campaigns expanded. The expectation that had once felt reasonable gradually became harder to sustain. Eventually, the remaining possibility vanished. The signal never returned. No crash marked the ending. No explosion. No final transmission announcing failure. Only a rover resting where it had become trapped. A machine that had survived far beyond its original mission. A machine that remained operational long enough to make the outcome feel avoidable. Looking back, the buried wheel appears different. At the beginning of the story, it looks like the cause. A rover stuck in sand. By the end, it looks more like the first link in a chain. The wheel removed mobility. The loss of mobility removed positioning. The loss of positioning reduced sunlight. The loss of sunlight reduced energy. The loss of energy reduced communication. And eventually, the last remaining option disappeared. Spirit did not lose because sand destroyed it. It lost a survival race against time, season, and the changing angle of the sun. The explorer remained where it was, waiting for conditions to improve. The conditions did improve. Spring eventually returned to Mars. The sunlight returned, but the voice never did. And the wheel buried in bright Martian soil became the beginning of an ending that unfolded one disappearing possibility at a time.